I'm going to be, you know, he keeps, we love this guy. He says, you're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one. We're closing the border and we're drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator, okay?
Yeah, you've seen that clip. I mean, we've all seen that clip a couple of times. You're wondering why I show it again. Because it matters. As the joke goes, you're never a dictator for just one day. You know, Trump is a walking id if you had, you know, psychology 101. You know, he doesn't do subtle. He doesn't do the quiet part. There's no quiet parts with Donald Trump. And that's what he's saying. Hey, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. We're going to shut down the border and we're going to drill. Well, you know, okay, that's a 2,700-mile border. You could line all of our troops up edge to edge and still not get the whole border. So good luck with that. But we are the number one oil producer in the world right now. We're the number one oil producer on planet Earth. And in the history of the planet, we're producing more than anybody. But he wants to be a dictator on day one, I guarantee it. And look, he keeps saying things, and it may not be as obvious as that one, but it's things like this clip right here where he laments the fact he just can't have an election while he's ahead in the polls right now. Watch this one.
I wish we could move the election to Tuesday. Is there anything we can do? I want to move the election to Tuesday. You know, in the UK, they can pick their election. They say, we're going to have the election next week. I want to be able to do that. Would that be possible?
Yeah, he hates the rules that constrain him. What are those rules? It's our Constitution. The United States Constitution limits the power. You know, we talk a lot about the Supreme Court being originalist, the Supreme Court being originalist. Well, the original point of this whole experiment was to get rid of a king who was taxing us from afar for his foreign wars and wasn't being fairly treated. We didn't have representation at all in Parliament. That's the whole point of this country, was that there is no one who's king. There's no one with unlimited power. And yet, here we are. How do I know here we are? Well, this happened.
Yes, I am here, if you can hear me. Let me read you a little bit of what we have from the court. It does find this. Under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. He is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts. There is no immunity for unofficial acts. That's the first blush we've got on this. It looks like a 6-3 split. We've got the dissent by Justice Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson join that. There is a kind of split decision on some of these. Somebody joins in one part, not in another part, but that's the overall holding of the court. So what it means now, we'll have to dig into this and see if they tell us now, how do you decide an official act versus an unofficial act? Because that's going to be critical, having now said the president does have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional.
Yeah, that's Fox News just reading the 6-3 results of the court's immunity decision, where they literally gave the president of the United States nearly unlimited, unchecked power and immunity from prosecution with the excuse that, well, what kind of power can a president wield if he's constantly worried about being charged with crimes? Well, the power is don't do freaking crimes. We don't want a president that commits crimes. That's the American way. So the Supreme Court now has weighed in, giving him that power. Maybe they know Democrats won't use it. Mr. Biden came out that very next day and said, I will never use this power. Maybe the next one will. I don't know. That's the risk they're willing to take because they think it's going to be them. It's going to give them power for years to come. So it really was a time to talk about the basis of this show on democracy and talk about the threats to our democracy, which is literally the original intent of this show. We talk a lot about electoral politics and the importance of it. I really wanted to talk about this specific threat, and I got the perfect guest because the danger of Trump has metastasized far beyond him. And the cancer is truly showing itself now in places like the Supreme Court. So here we are. I wanted to circle back with that. I got the perfect guest, as I always do. And so we're going to get on with it. As always, I am Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy FP1. That's where you are right now on the On Democracy Podcast YouTube channel, or, of course, Midas Touch Network on your Friday night show. Let's get on with the show. Welcome back. I am still Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy with FP Wellman, right here on the Midas Touch Network. I don't know, On Democracy YouTube channel, which is growing. Please subscribe. Oh my God, your favorite podcast platform. My God, we're everywhere. And now you're here with us on a Friday night, Friday the 13th. Don't be fooled. It's a great day to be here. Look, we were talking about before the opening that, Trump wants to be a dictator on day one. He wants to do all these things. And we all kind of laughed it off for a while, but then the Supreme Court turned around and made it legal. And so I thought, we've been talking about campaign stuff for a while, as I mentioned in the opening. I wanted to circle back to the show. The show is called On Democracy for a reason. So let's take a pause and let's go back to the basics of this thing, the threats to our democracy, which is one of the things that drove me to start this show over 2 years ago. I couldn't find a better guest. Timing is everything. He's got a good PR person to call me. Professor David M. Driesen, university professor at the Syracuse College of Law, beautiful Syracuse, New York, focuses on constitutional law, economics, environmental law. Professor Driesen has written 4 books, including most recently, the one we brought together for us today is The Specter of Dictatorship, Judicial Enabling of Presidential Power. Professor Driesen engages in public service, defending democracy, environmental laws, constitutionality, and efforts to combat the climate crisis. Professor, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here today, sir.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you published The Specter of Dictatorship, okay, Judicial Enabling of Presidential Power in 2021, sir. Many people in America thought the MAGA movement might fade with Trump's defeat, but it's hard not to argue it in many ways only became more extreme, more toxic. And then came the Supreme Court, has made it even more dangerous, I think, in a lot of ways. With 3 years behind us since you wrote the book and observing what's going on, what do you see as the danger of this moment? I mean, has the danger gone? Are you seeing even more warning signs going off since you wrote the book?
Well, I'm seeing, even more warning signs. When I wrote the book, everybody thought that Trump was following sort of a small, gradual approach to establishing an autocracy, sort of like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Erdogan in Turkey. But it's become more violent with the January 6th insurrection, and then the threatening of violence against judges, prosecutors, and election workers, and seeing people resign in the election space and be replaced by people who we can't count on to honestly certify a vote. So it's become and Trump threatening to use troops to put down demonstrations on his first day. It's become possible to imagine this might be more quick. It might be a little bit more like the violent overthrows of governments that we associate with Hitler and Mussolini than like these slower models. So it's tricky now to figure out which autocracy model he was following. When I wrote that book, we thought it was the slow, gradual thing, but it's no longer clear that that's right.
And that's how it goes, right? I mean, it's hard to say right now. And the Trump movement and the MAGA movement is bigger than Trump now, right? I mean, that's the thing. I think a lot of us thought, well, I'm not going to say us because I wasn't one of them. I live in Missouri, right? So I know how deeply this movement, this autocratic mentality goes. I mean, we've got candidates using flamethrowers in every freaking commercial here in this crazy state, Republican candidates. It does go long beyond a Trumpism and to a movement that is with autocratic means. And that is the Heritage Foundation and 90 of their friends writing Project 2025, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It's discouraging because the Heritage Foundation long identified themselves as a beacon of freedom. That was their thing, small government, and yet you find them laying plans that use this Orban model mostly to establish autocracy, that try to get rid of the tradition of having independent public servants who follow the law, and say instead, well, they should follow the president's agenda. Well, the president's agenda is mostly a set of requests for Congress. When you say that the executive branch of government should follow a president's agenda, that sounds like an autocracy, and it certainly sounds that way when the president in question has said he wants to use the government to persecute political opponents, and he has used it in the past to try to protect his friends. Yeah. So it's pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and you see it very direct as Agenda 47 videos, what he's saying. It's one of those classic situations where I spoke with Jared Moskowitz, the congressman, when I was at the DNC, and he says, the amazing thing about Project 2025 is they actually wrote this down. I mean, other countries, like you said, Erdogan and others, they did it subtly, but these guys don't do subtle, do they? They published a 900-page book with the plan in it and got $25 million to back it up. I mean, so it's at some point we have to believe what they're saying, don't we?
Yeah, well, I think we do, and if you look at not only that Trump, of course, tried to walk away from it.
Yeah.
But it's mostly his officials who are writing it.
Yeah.
And not only that, it's very congruent with what Trump is saying. I mean, what the plan does is it lays the sort of the structural groundwork for three key things that autocrats do to erode democracies. They tilt the electoral playing field in their favor. They use prosecution to protect their friends and go after their enemies. And they shrink the public space for debate. And so, for example, you find in there proposals to defund NPR, to deny access to the spectrum it currently occupies, and deny and to remove exemptions from licensing fees for public broadcasting. And you see restructuring of the executive branch so that the FBI is accountable to the president. Well, the FBI is supposed to, we have a 10-year term for a reason, so that they're independent. And likewise, while you've seen Trump actively trying to subvert electoral integrity on the state level, which is probably the most important because they do the counting of votes, but there's also proposals in there to hamstring the FEC and make sure it doesn't go after Trump's corruption with campaign contributions and so on, and transfer some authority to the DOJ so that they can go ahead and persecute their political opponents for fake charges of corruption, which is something they get from Viktor Orban.
Right. And we see that now. We see, it's the common tool of throwing an FEC violation against a candidate for office to kind of scare them and intimidate them. The smell of scandal, like, oh, where'd they get their money from? And it turns out the whole thing was fake. And then there's scary parts. Like you said, FEC is one people forget about. FTC is one we forget about. Just about the FTC, you can decide who can have business and who can't. There's some very slippery slope places that go very dangerous places. And a lot of us focus on, the violent part, like as you mentioned, using the National Guard to suppress free speech and public discourse. But in the end, you're right. It's like truly the ability to create outcasts within our own society, don't they?
Yeah, it really is. And, we've seen this before. I don't think people understand January 6th, I think, to some degree, but there are other things that were going on in that administration, like to defeat checks and balances. President Trump was constantly removing Senate-approved officials and putting in his own cronies. And when he had all those people in place in the immigration authorities, in the immigration paramilitary forces, he used them on the streets of Portland, Oregon to terrorize people when they were using the Black Lives Matter demonstration as a pretext. And they were ostensibly supposed to protect federal property, but they were scooping up innocent people that weren't threatening federal property in unmarked vans and detaining them briefly. They were terrifying people. And so we've already seen this movie. So it's pretty awful. And Trump was trying to systematically dismantle the rule of law throughout his administration. He lost something like 90% of his court cases and regulatory and immigration cases, which is an astonishing record of utter lawlessness.
And
so
practice,
dangerous.
Practice is what that was. I mean, like you said, they brought in Homeland Security people for the demonstration in Washington. It was the park police in riot gear that cleared out Lafayette Square so he could have his Bible holding event. And circling back to that larger erosion you just talked about, a topic we often cover here on the show on Democracy, especially when we're not talking the election, is this erosion of the democratic institution and norms, right? I mean, Trump's stunt at Arlington a couple weeks ago is a great example of how norms and even laws are now simply getting ignored. You've highlighted some of the specific checks and balances that were destroyed or weakened during Trump's first. I mean, you mentioned a couple here. What are those? So I think for you, along that line we're just discussing, what are some of the most dangerous that have been overlooked from that first term, the most dangerous things that he did as far as the checks and balances and just kind of blowing through those norms that are a perfect demonstration of what we face if he was able to return to power?
Well, there's so many of them and they work together, but to single out a couple of them, the abuse of emergency powers. Now, remember, Trump wanted to build this wall on the southern border, and Congress said, no, that's silly. We'll fund a little fencing, but we're not going to fully fund this law. So Trump declares an emergency and seeks to reprogram funds under these emergency authorities. All the lower courts block it, and then the Supreme Court stays their ruling so they can go ahead. So power first is pretty important. A state of emergency is a classic way of justifying invasion of liberty and taking power away from legislative branch. So that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And I would say the displacement of civil servants is a big deal, because the reason we have independent agencies, especially electoral commissions and media authorities, that the reason that they're independent is they're not supposed to be controlled by one person in their party. They're supposed to be independent. Otherwise, you have regulators using authority over the media to shut down the opposition and promote the supporters. And you can have the same thing going on with tilting the electoral playing field. And so Trump's constant firings of people, his harassment of civil service, his attempt to claim authority to fire all sorts of civil servants, which Project 2025 proposes to resurrect.
Yep.
This is all very dangerous because it turns the government into something that tries to operate in a law framework to advance people's interest into just supporters of President Trump who put down everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've talked about in the Project 2025 book. I mean, and the speakers, the authors, when they speak of just giving to a Democratic candidate is enough of them to question your loyalty and use that as an excuse for firing you. And that's a very scary place where even having your own rights are being questioned for federal employment or contractors, for that matter. It's millions of people, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of people, and we depend on them for all sorts of things: air traffic control, environmental protection. The independence of the Federal Reserve might be in question. You may not like everything they do, but there's a reason they're independent, because when they're influenced by politics, they screw up terribly. Yeah. Right now, we're getting pretty good decisions. Inflation is coming down because nobody messes with them. But if you start having any authority of the federal government can be abused to punish enemies and reward friends. And that's where you end up going if you get rid of all this independence and then have the president like Trump, whose whole thing is about support, or you're on my side or not.
Yep.
And that's it. So,
or even scarier sometimes, to be honest with you, a President Vance. Right. I mean, it's that classic thing we talked about a lot. I think when Ron DeSantis was first rising, there was a lot of talk about, well, he's a smarter version of Trump. And there's an argument to be made that what saved us in a lot of ways is that Trump is a walking id, right? He spits out, he doesn't know the whole quiet part out loud. There's no quiet part with Trump. He says it all, which is why I have clips to open the show where he talks about, oh, haha, I'll be a dictator. But a Vance, who's a little bit more slimy and has even less morals, could even be more dangerous with the hands of that kind of power that he's been given, isn't it?
Well, it's quite possible. I think both of them get pretty good advice from people like the Heritage Foundation. So you have the Supreme Court has been pushing this theory that the president should have complete control over the executive branch. Yep. They read the Constitution that way. I think it's an incorrect reading of the Constitution, but it's certainly consistent with the practices of elected leaders who establish autocracy. They want complete control. They destroy independent institutions. And in my view, they've pretty well destroyed the Supreme Court at this point. That immunity ruling is shocking. Nobody thought, well, I thought they might do this, but most observers thought they would never go there, right? Because it's a court dedicated to original intent. It's completely opposite to original intent. The excuse for it is a terrible political judgment that a president would never vigorously carry out his duties if he faced the threat of criminal prosecution when he commits crimes. Well, that's ridiculous. There's no history of that being a problem.
Right.
And you want to deter presidents from committing crimes. It's vital.
Yeah. It's a national interest. I think it's a great place to pause. We have a great sponsor this week. We'll take a sponsor. I want to pull that Supreme Court thread when we come back. If you're like me, you understand the pain of finding out what to wear each day. I mean, most clothes I have are uncomfortable, never actually the size I really am, and not to mention how much time is wasted trying to find a good outfit. And when you do have a good fit, you can only wear it for a few hours. We have to change for an important meeting or dinner, find a new outfit. Now, everyone wants to dress well at all times because, simply put, it's a confidence booster, even for men like me. Men's closets were due for a radical overhaul and reinvention, and Rhone stepped up to the challenge. Rhone's commuter collection is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible set of products known to man, and here's why. Rowan helps you get ready for any occasion with the commuter collection, which offers the world's most comfortable pants, dress shirts, quarter zips, and polos. You've never have to worry about what to wear when you have the Rowan commuter collection. With Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, Rowan is 100% machine washable, so you can just ditch it all in the dry cleaner or ditch the dry cleaner completely, put it all in your own washing machine yourself. You know, I'm obsessed with the Rowan commuter collection. We're on the move a lot, whether it's I'm catching a flight or I'm going to a meeting or whatever. The Rowan commuter collection has never let me down so far. The commuter collection get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to head to rowan.com/Fred. Use promo code Fred to save 20% off your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/Fred and use code Fred. It's time for you to find your corner office of comfort. Check out our sponsor, Rowan. I hope you'll buy some outfits today. And you know, before we left for the break, you talked about the Roberts Court, you know, and I was thinking, you know, this court's off the rails. I mean, your book is about Judicial. We don't talk about that enough. We've got them shopping. It seems like every lawsuit for the Trump, anything that's Trump or MAGA goes to Western Texas now because they've got the right judges there. You know, they've created a pipeline directly to the Supreme Court. Honestly, it just feels like our court system in a lot of ways has really gone off the rails. And today's Supreme Court is laying the groundwork in autocracy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it really is. It's done so many things that create that problem, and especially recently, but even going back a ways. And so it has these, you know, this decision I mentioned before, silo law, where I didn't mention it before, but I mentioned the unitary executive theory.
Yeah.
And it says, well, you have absolute right to fire the single head of an agency, even when Congress and the president said they shouldn't be somebody that you should only fire them for cause.
Right.
Well, if you fire them for cause, you can get rid of somebody who's doing something illegal, but you can't get rid of them because you want them not to implement the law or something. You have to let them implement the law. And so it's a direct way of establishing autocracy. And that's what Project 2025 is relying on in suggesting to get rid of the civil service. Because if you start with this principle that the president controls everything, then the civil service protections don't look logical. And so they might be something the court would mess with, and certainly they seem prepared to mess with independent agencies. So this is part of how they've laid the groundwork for autocracy. I think also the way the deferential approach that the court takes to assertions of emergency power or national security is very dangerous. You go back to the beginning of the Trump administration, you had these travel bans instituted. The lower courts blocked them. It gets to the Supreme Court. It's clear they're being they're motivated by a religious animus against Muslims.
Yeah. And
that makes them unconstitutional. The court blows past that because if they were ever to oversee a national security claim, however bogus, they'd be hamstringing the president. And so you get this doctrine that suggests if you assert national security, you can invade civil liberties. That's very dangerous. The immunity decision is dangerous. The court, Trump was busy resisting congressional oversight, right and left, trying to discourage people to testify for Congress, even in an impeachment proceeding. And one of these cases gets up to the Supreme Court, and it kind of further hamstrings oversight authority. It says, well, you have to prove to the federal court that you have it's really needed to get the president's papers to do a particular piece of legislation. And that's a stricter test that hadn't been there before, except for executive privilege. And so it's really quite shocking in a lot of ways. They're stripping out checks and balances based on sort of an extreme version of separation of powers, where separation of powers means nobody can check the president.
To include them, by the way. I mean, I think one of the things that shocks me is the resistance to the Supreme Court to any kind of oversight, any kind of an ethics rules. I had a Supreme Court gentleman, an expert in the Supreme Court, a month ago now. We talked about that. I mean, in the idea that the only court and the only judges, the only appointed officials in America that can't be restrained by any kinds of ethical laws or any kind of oversight is the Supreme Court. We've created these lifetime appointees with unlimited power, haven't we?
Yeah, we really have. And it's over the top to say they can't be subject to some kind of ethics regime. The Congress really needs to impose that on them. They probably need to do some impeachment investigations of judges that have some ethical problems. This has to stop, and the abuse is really shocking. One of the areas that the court, in the past, the court usually waited for an appellate court to make a ruling, and often for a circuit split between the circuits before it would take a matter up. During the Trump administration, for the first time, they regularly reviewed cases that haven't even been tried yet. They would get involved in preliminary orders in the district court to protect the Republican agenda. And they're doing this today with election cases.
Yeah.
And it's very shocking overreach. And I think there's a need for some jurisdiction stripping, certainly detailed legislation that should limit the use of emergency review to emergencies like somebody facing an improperly imposed death penalty. It shouldn't be a routine way of defeating the Democrats and advancing the Republicans' positions, which is what it's become.
And it does seem like everybody forgets those positions can switch. I mean, there could come a day where it's, where Democrats in power with this kind of power that they're trying to check, but they've given. I mean, there's nothing to say we won't have a Democrat who thinks he's doing, they are doing the right thing and uses that power themselves. It does seem like the opponents here, the Republicans especially, are somewhat short-sighted. Do you ever have any insight into why they don't see that this is a double-edged sword?
I don't have any special insight into that. They probably realize that it could be, but they think they can just keep winning this way. They may be desperate.
Right.
Because they're a party that really represents corporate interest in the rich at a time when a lot of people are suffering from economic inequality that's become a big issue, and they feel like the government's abandoned them. So to get away with that, they feel they have to militantly control the institutions, and this polarization has really destroyed the Supreme Court. And we've seen this in other countries. Hungary, for example, required a 2/3 vote to appoint justices. Well, when you have that, you get reasonable, balanced people that are accepted to both parties. And that used to be what we did, because we had a Senate filibuster rule, which affected the same thing. Then they abolished all those rules. And the Democrats, by the way, abolished them in the district courts. It was not completely one-sided. Right. And then you get this situation where you can appoint people that nobody on the other side supports because they're obvious partisans, and that nobody thinks they're going to be a fair judge. And that's a very dangerous, that destroys a court.
I never even heard the terminology. I mean, it's a perfect example is, I think just in the last 5-10 years, or what, 10 years really, the idea of every time we have a judge is mentioned, when you mention a politician, there's, Republican from Kansas, right? Whatever it may be. Now we do that with judges, right? Appointed by Bush, appointed by Trump. I mean, it seems like it feels like a new thing to me. I just don't remember years ago where we regularly name checked who appointed a judge as a way of insight into their reasoning. This feels new to me. Is that new to me?
Yeah, it's something Trump propagated. He started this business in 2016. It's interesting because Roberts pushed back against this. He saw this was going to be detrimental to respect for the courts. And I have to say the lower courts have behaved fairly admirably and objectively. You saw this especially in the 2020 election, when more than 60 federal judges, including judges appointed by President Trump, repudiated these election lies and said there's no irregularities here. So we saw some pretty good indications that everything is not that partisan, but it is that partisan at the Supreme Court. Yeah. And that's a big problem. So it's become a problem. And what's weird is I think the Supreme Court has now bought into this to some extent, because if you look at this case about keeping Trump off the ballot because he engaged in insurrection from Colorado, there was a really weird ruling because, again, originalism says, yep, he can't be president, which would seem to lead to the conclusion that you can't put him on the ballot. The court resisted that partly by some suggestion that maybe a different judge would have come to a different conclusion than the trial court judge in Colorado, even though there was no claim of any clear error. And that's not how courts behave in the past. They would, if a judge of whatever party had found that he committed insurrection, he committed insurrection unless you can find a serious error in the factual record, which nobody ever claimed. So It's really quite shocking.
So it's not out. It's just not out the realm of possible that we've got an essentially an out of control court. And I hope something's done about that. You know, we discussed that Trump isn't the only. We talked about it a little bit earlier. I want to pull that thread some more. Is, you know, the attacks of our democracy, and your book talks about this. You know, the attacks. It's bigger than the movement. It's bigger than this moment. You know, what are some of the reasons you think you talk about in the book this slow decline of our American democracy, right? You know, it didn't just start with Trump, right? It's been going for a while, hasn't it? And what are some of the hallmarks you think that go beyond just the Trumpism and this movement? What are some of the hallmarks of this slow decline that we haven't been paying attention to the elements of our democracy?
Yeah, there's several things. One of them is, as the U.S. has become a world power and quite anxious about a lot of things, there's been a tendency to augment presidential power by the court.
Yeah.
That's the court, and that's been a problem. The other thing is, especially since I'd say around 1995, there's been growing political polarization in the country, and that creates a situation where parties think that their losses are redeemable and they just can't lose, so they have to start breaking the customs that allow a democracy to function. So an example is the legislature used to decide things by majority vote. Every now and then you get a filibuster in the Senate, but it wasn't routine practice. Now it's routine. You used to have deliberation in committees and things would get studied if you had a difficult problem. Now more often there are these quickie bills that are cobbled together and sometimes rammed through by a party without anybody reading it. So this polarization now is reflected in the courts. It's reflected in the electorate. And it makes it really hard for democracy to function, because to have the democracy function, you have to, first of all, make compromises to get legislation that deals with the nation's problems. And that has to be a compromise because different people see it differently. And then you have to have an executive branch that's willing to implement the laws, whether they like them or not, because they see that as their duty. And all that has been eroding now for a very long time.
Yeah, and it's not going away. I mean, do you see solutions? I mean, do you see a future? I mean, what are the answers that you would expect, for example, legislative or otherwise, that can navigate us away from this?
Well, one of the things, if the Republicans lose in a landslide, they might start to rethink.
Right, the proverbial out in the wilderness for a while, right?
Right, and that might cause them to rethink. Otherwise, I think there are a lot of reforms that could help, but only at the margins, and they'd be hard to enact. So an ethics code with the court would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think some jurisdiction stripping from the courts. I don't think the court should be deciding important national issues routinely. Yeah. Maybe when there's a circuit split, there's a need for uniformity. But this idea that everything that's important should go to the Supreme Court, I'd like to see us get away from that. I'd like to get rid of the filibuster rules in the Senate. They're very anti-democratic.
Yeah.
Some of these ranked choice voting ideas, where it's not a winner-take-all primary, would help.
Yeah.
Some legislation limiting party gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is a big cause of polarization, right? Because you have one party gets a hold of the legislature. Both parties do this. I'd say the Republicans have been more ruthless and efficient about it, but they both do this. They get control of the legislature, and then they redraw congressional districts to favor them. And the result of that is you can elect partisans that are really quite radical instead of getting somebody who appeals to both parties. We really need some legislation limiting gerrymandering. The Supreme Court should have done that, but it stayed out of it in one of its many, many anti-democratic rulings. But that would help a lot. Protecting voting rights would help a lot. So we get out of this new voting rights legislation. So we get out of this business of trying to game the system and say, look, if you want to win, you have to appeal to the majority of people.
Right.
You can't just keep doing what you're doing and then game the system and propagandize people.
Yeah. Yeah. And picking your voters instead of picking your representatives is what is how things are driven these days, it feels like. And again, I live in Missouri, so I'm living it, large. And it's funny how often people say to me, I just can't believe that Missouri used to be a bellwether state. I'm like, oh, well, you haven't been living here. And by the way, it's coming your way if you allow it to, if you're allowed to get too far down the road. There's a lot to think about. I try to leave on an optimistic note, but sometimes it's hard, right? It is things. But what I do hear is circling back, a landslide would be great. Taking the House and Senate would be everything. And then doing the things that, it's one of the things I was excited about seeing Tim Walz in the ticket was like they did in Minnesota, like they did in Michigan. It's like we had a 1-vote majority and they passed through the legislation quickly to make these reforms they need to make in their state. And that feels like something you would be enthusiastic for, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think I see some hope.
Yeah.
In Poland, when I was writing, they had a government that was moving toward authoritarianism, and that government lost the civic platform. And what the opposition did is it appealed to love and unity. Yeah. Well, that's a lot of what you see from the Harris-Walz campaign now.
Yeah,
is they are trying to be joyful. Yeah. They're not echoing my doom and gloom thing. They are defending democracy in very clear ways, I think, and recognizing the Trump threat, but they're trying not to do things that might, incite despair and gloom.
Right.
And I think there's some hope that could turn things around. But it's going to be a long, at least in terms of getting Trump on board. And then you have to try to get the rest of the Republican Party. I think some of the defections in the Republican Party are helpful because what the political scientists say is it's the party of the autocrat has to screen him out. And when that doesn't happen, you're in trouble. And the Republicans failed at this with the impeachment proceedings and now with lining up behind him for the nomination. On the other hand, you have an awful lot of his cabinet, an awful lot of ex-congressmen and other officials saying, we can't have this guy. I'm voting for Harris-Walz. So that's helpful.
Yeah. It's progress as we start seeing it. And I think we're seeing more of it. I think we're more in defections. It's not like it was in 2020. It's actually more pronounced because January 6th was such an extreme event, and the Project 2025 plan is so extreme that you just can't deny that the goal is what it is. And of course, we've seen them demonstrate what they're going to do. Dobbs is a perfect example. It's energized people who didn't realize. People are so comfortable. So I guess I'm hopeful. I get hopeful because I realize that people are waking up to the reality that no, it's not a theory anymore, that we really do face a danger as a country that is irreversible if we let it go.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you said earlier, that one of Trump's things is that he's too obvious. Well, what we see is when one of the reasons authoritarians try to use this gradual nonviolent approach is it's kind of imperceptible to people. They just slowly corrupt institutions. And it looked like Trump was doing that, but nobody can view it that way after January 6th.
Right.
That was a frontal assault on democracy. So, like you were saying, he hasn't been subtle. He's done things that are so egregious and obvious and violent that it's very hard for anybody people are somehow not seeing that he's an autocrat, but it's very obvious.
Well, I appreciate it. Professor, thanks. This has been a great conversation about the topic of the show on democracy. I appreciate everything you do, and it's a hard topic. It was great to have this conversation. Where can people find you? Where can they find the book or more information about what you're doing or your articles?
Yeah, well, here's the book.
There it is.
There it is. The Specter of Dictatorship, Judicial Enabling of Presidential Power. Nice pictures of upside down White Houses. It's from Stanford University Press. You can order it on Amazon.com or at Stanford University Press. And, I've just been rereading it because I'm teaching it in class, which is sort of hard for me to get the necessary distance to do that properly. But I think it will help you see some of the patterns and that, it's a useful tool in putting what we see in the U.S. in sort of a broader context of our constitutional history and also the history of democratic decline in other places.
Yep. Great stuff. Well, this is the time to know these things. We can fight it. Like you said, it's not going to end with November 5th. It's going to keep on going. We're going to could take a generation for all we know to kind of clear the space and get us back to where we were, our roots. So Professor Driesen, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. Keep up the fight. Tell everybody that and stay in touch.
Thank you. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Ooh, great conversation. We haven't had a conversation in a while about that very thing, the topic of this show on democracy and the threats to this democracy and what drives those and where we are. Again, I am all in on the Harris-Walz approach, that the positivity, the fact that we can move forward, we're moving forward, but we also have to remind everybody what the danger is, and it's not going to end on November 5th. We do need to give them a landslide. We really do. And we can't rest our laurels as Governor Walz says all the time. We'll we'll rest when we're dead. And by the time you see this show, we're 50 days or so out. I mean, this is it, folks. We are down to the half double digits. Look, we can sleep anytime. You have to get in the fight. Find your own way to get in it. And I hope we do. I hope if we are able to give a President Harris and a Vice President Waltz the power they need with a Senate, a majority, a strong majority, a House majority to pass bills as Governor Waltz did in Minnesota with just a 1-vote majority to pass the necessary bills to enshrine abortion rights, to enshrine equal opportunity, to enshrine those things and protect the least of us. Because if we don't protect the least of us, then we're not going to help the most of us. And so I really do feel passionately that our mission now, folks, the polls are looking good. Don't sleep on it. Get involved. Pick up your phone. Call your local campaign. There is a campaign at every level that needs your help. I guarantee. I bet my mango left foot and my youngest child from that there is a campaign in your district where you live right now that needs you to wave signs, needs you to put a sign up in your yard, needs you to get out and knock doors and convince your neighbors. Our goal here at On Democracy is to kind of arm you with the information that when you go to that barbecue, when you go to that holiday event, you are armed with the information to make a convincing argument to those who don't or on the edge. Tell them, look, this is the danger. I just saw a show the other day, and this professor wrote a book talking about the dangers. It's all there for us to see. You just have to see it. So I hope we do that. I hope we arm you with information. In the meantime, thanks for joining us. I appreciate all your support. This is, I guess, 102 episodes now. And as you can see, I've gotten my voice back after a couple weeks. And it is great to be with you. So in the meantime, as I always say, keep up the fight. Get in the fight. We are winning. We will win. But it's going to take all of us to do it. With that, we'll see you next week.